Why does the place meant to protect us so often become the setting for our first wounds? Why is it that when we're at our most fragile, wide open, eager to love without conditions, we receive the deepest scars? It's not strangers who mark us first. It's not the outside world that wounds us in childhood. It's the family. It's the father whose voice strikes like thunder. It's the mother whose silence cuts deeper than a scream. It's that small, intimate space where everything should feel safe, and yet so often feels like a cage. Kafka knew this long before he had words to explain it. Stories and novels weren't enough for him to express it. He had to write a letter to his own father, as if throwing a cry into a well, hoping the echo might return something more than silence. In that text, raw, lucid, almost unbearable in its honesty, he doesn't complain like a victim or accuse like an enemy. He simply tries to understand how a man he loved so deeply could hurt him in such invisible and, at the same time, irreversible ways. That contradiction, loving the one who breaks you, craving approval from the one who wounds you, searching for warmth where there was only shadow, is perhaps the most painful root of human suffering. We don't choose to be born. We don't choose the hands that first hold us, the voices that give us our names, or the eyes that begin judging us before we can even walk. We just fall into a story already written, surrounded by people carrying their own wounds, their own regrets, their own unresolved shadows. Kafka never accused his father of being a monster. He described him as an ordinary man, harsh in his normalcy, blind in his sense of duty, unable to see the sensitivity of a son who didn't know how to protect himself. And that's where the tragedy begins, in the inability of both to meet without causing pain. As children, love comes without filters. We love with our whole body, with a desperate need to be seen, touched, acknowledged. But if that love is met not with tenderness, but with harshness, coldness, or disdain, the child doesn't question the adult. The child questions himself. Before he even learns to speak, he learns that something in him is wrong. Kafka didn't portray his father as cruel by choice, but as someone incapable of seeing. And that blindness, toward the emotional world of a child, can become a form of slow destruction. There are no bruises. Sometimes no yelling. Just a constant chill. A wall. A distance that turns the child into a ghost inside his own home. And what does a child do with that? He can't run away. He can't fight back. All he can do is adapt. And to adapt, he often has to betray himself. He has to shut down his sensitivity, hide his tears, harden from the inside, or disappear altogether. That's how broken adults are born, not always from obvious trauma, but from daily small erasures, from that creeping sense of never being enough. Kafka learned to write because he couldn't speak. His voice had no place in the house. His way of seeing was not the one that was wanted. His presence, instead of being celebrated, was measured, compared, reshaped. How could fear not take root in someone who learns so early that he won't be loved unless he becomes someone else? What's most disturbing is that family trauma doesn't come wrapped in the clear violence of an enemy. It comes disguised as care, as authority, as protection. That's why it's so hard to spot. That's why it embeds itself so deeply. A father can destroy his child without ever raising his voice. A mother can erase her daughter's identity with nothing more than a look of disappointment. Kafka knew this. He lived it. And he wrote about it, not to blame, but to dig to the bottom of his anguish, like someone clawing at an old wound, not to heal it, but to finally see what it contains. You can't fully understand Kafka's work without reading that letter. Without entering that dark room of his childhood where everything became symbolic, judgment, punishment, absurdity, the desire to escape, and the impossibility of doing so. His writing is a map of that trauma. But beyond literature, what Kafka lays bare is a truth many feel but few dare to face head-on. Family isn't always synonymous with love. Blood ties can also be chains of guilt. And the first wound, the one that shapes us most, often happens when we're too young to understand it, too innocent to deserve it, too voiceless to name it. And by the time we can name it, the damage is already done. We're adults trying to put together a puzzle with missing or shattered pieces, looking for explanations to our anxieties, our emotional blocks, our sadness that seems to come out of nowhere. Kafka didn't write to comfort. He wrote to expose. To show that pain isn't the exception, it's the rule dressed up in family photos. Behind so many masks of strength, success, or intelligence, there's often a frightened child who still hasn't been heard. So what do we do with that wound? Do we forgive the one who caused it? Do we forget? Do we just live with it? Kafka doesn't offer answers. But his silence, his clarity, his elegant despair push us to look where we least want to look. To accept that not everything that comes from family is a blessing. That sometimes, the first step toward freedom is recognizing that we were hurt by the people we needed the most. Maybe that's why his characters never find their way out of the maze. Maybe that's why they're always chasing something they can't name. Because at the core of Kafka's story is a haunting reminder: the hardest part of life isn't growing up, it's healing without having to destroy those who hurt us. It's looking in the mirror and deciding that the child who wasn't heard finally gets to speak. And that he deserves to be believed. Even if it's too late to rewrite the past. Even if the father never reads the letter. Even if the trauma still breathes in the shadow of every word. When Kafka wrote to his father, it wasn't to hurt him or to get an apology. He did it because he needed to understand what had happened to him. How a boy who just wanted to be loved ended up becoming a man haunted by invisible guilt, by a nameless shame, and by a fear that wouldn't go away, not with reason, not with time. There's something deeply heartbreaking about that kind of search. It wasn't hate that drove Kafka to write. It was the need to explain to himself why being a son had hurt so much. We don't fear our fathers because they look monstrous. We fear them because their gaze becomes the measure of everything. What they approve of becomes value. What they reject becomes flaw. Kafka describes how even the slightest attempt to show vulnerability was met with mockery, disdain, or impatience. And that kind of pain doesn't just hurt in the moment. It lingers. It shapes the way you grow. It plants the belief that something inside you is wrong. That there's a fundamental flaw in who you are that no one can fix. And so, life becomes a silent act of atonement. A constant effort to be worthy, even if you no longer know worthy of what, or for whom. Kafka's father wasn't a villain. He was a man living by his own rules: strength, discipline, hard work. He didn't see sensitivity as a gift. He saw it as a weakness. Kafka, on the other hand, was made of thoughts, questions, fears, and doubts. And in that clash, no one was completely to blame, but the son carried the wound. Because the child always loves first. Loves even when it hurts. Loves even when they're afraid. Loves even when all they get in return is silence or humiliation. That's the cruel paradox. Trauma doesn't always come from lack of love, but from love that doesn't know how to love back. It's the little things that cut the deepest. The things no one else notices. A dismissive comment. A comparison to another sibling. A look of annoyance when you talk about what lights you up inside. Kafka remembers how every time he tried to share something of himself, his father either ignored him or made him feel ridiculous. That pattern, repeated enough, becomes a belief that follows you to the grave. That what you carry inside has no value. That the thing that makes you unique is, in fact, the thing that makes you wrong. How do you heal from that? How do you live with an idea lodged like a splinter in the center of your chest? Kafka didn't have the answers. What he did have was the courage to look without flinching. To write without sugarcoating. Instead of numbing the pain, he used it as raw material for his thinking. And that's where the true weight of his legacy lies. In his refusal to forget. In his conscious decision not to justify the unjust, not to polish the image of his father just to fit the clean, comfortable story of the ideal family that everyone wants to believe in. What Kafka brings to light isn't just his own story, it's the story of thousands of people who grew up feeling like outsiders in their own home. People who learned from an early age that being accepted meant not being themselves. That tenderness came with conditions, attention was scarce, and judgment was constant. People who still, even now, revert to that scared 5-year-old when they talk to their parents. Who watch the adult they've built crumble with a single word spoken in that old familiar tone. Kafka was one of the few who dared to name that invisible prison. The kind of love that feels like a debt, the shame of not being who you're supposed to be, the pain of being trapped in a cycle you can't break without breaking something inside you. It's not easy to admit that our families might have hurt us. We're taught that blood is thicker than any wound. That respect should be absolute. That speaking about our pain is a betrayal. Kafka shattered that silent agreement, not to get revenge, but to free something that could no longer stay locked away. Because what we don't say doesn't disappear. It sinks in. It festers. It turns into anxiety, into insomnia, into illnesses without explanation, into broken relationships, into an inability to trust even those who truly love us. Some people read Kafka and say he's dark, depressive, too heavy. But maybe the brightest part of his work is precisely that, the radical honesty. The bravery of not pretending everything was fine. Of refusing to go along with the official story that says home is always a safe place. Kafka turns pain into language, silence into voice, fear into a map. And though he offers no solutions, he offers something just as rare, companionship. Because in his desperate confession, you feel a little less alone. A little less guilty for feeling broken. A little more valid in your own hurt. At some point, all of us have to decide what to do with what childhood left behind. Some people repeat the pattern. Others run from it. Some try to make sense of it. Kafka chose to write, not because it healed him, but because it was the only way he wouldn't disappear. The only way he could say, this happened to me. And even if you can't see it, even if you'll never understand, it's real. And it still hurts. In a world where most people would rather stay quiet than make others uncomfortable, that's an act of immense courage. And yet, there's no resentment in his voice. There's sorrow. A sorrow so deep it doesn't need embellishment. A sorrow that doesn't seek revenge, but understanding. Kafka didn't want to destroy the image of his father. He wanted to see him as he truly was, towering, powerful, and unable to recognize the fragile beauty in his own child. And in choosing to see him without hate, but also without illusion, Kafka left behind something for the rest of us, those still trying to find our place in a story we didn't choose. Those still trying to figure out how to love without self-betrayal, how to heal without forgetting, how to finally speak with a voice that is fully ours. Maybe the most unsettling part of all this is that even after recognizing the wound, peace doesn't always follow. Sometimes, staring directly at what hurt us doesn't bring relief. It opens up a different kind of emptiness. As if, by tearing down the myth of perfect love, we're left floating in some kind of emotional orphanhood. We're no longer trapped, but we have nowhere to return to either. Kafka lived in that kind of inner exile, far from his father, yet still chained to his gaze. He couldn't fully break free. He couldn't outrun the weight of that presence that marked him forever without ever raising a hand. Because the truth is, family trauma doesn't dissolve with time, not even with distance. We carry it like a constant echo, like a question that never gets answered. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't it enough just to be who I was? Kafka never got an answer from his father. But maybe he didn't really need one. In his writing, he found a way to answer himself. To say that his pain made sense. That what he went through wasn't made up, wasn't dramatic, wasn't meaningless. What hurts most isn't just the wound, it's the denial of it. The pretending nothing happened. The silence of those who should have protected us. Kafka didn't write to accuse, but he didn't write to forgive either. He wrote to remind us that suffering can't be erased with justifications. That the human soul doesn't understand, I did it for your own good, when what it felt was rejection, humiliation, or abandonment. And maybe that's one of the hardest truths his life leaves us with. Love, when it doesn't know how to see, can hurt more than hate. Not all parents are cruel. Many are just hurting. Many didn't know how to do better. Many repeat what they lived through, without ever realizing it. Kafka understood that. But he understood it without minimizing what he went through. That's the sharpness of his insight, recognizing the other's humanity without betraying your own. Because you can understand why someone did what they did, and still let yourself feel the pain they caused. You can forgive without staying silent. You can love without romanticizing. You can let go without pretending to forget. Maybe that's why his letter was never sent. Maybe he knew it wasn't really for his father, it was for himself. A desperate attempt to give shape to chaos, to rescue some personal truth from the wreckage. A way not to be consumed by the fear of not being good enough. A way to reclaim, if only through words, the right to exist exactly as he was. Not needing to be strong. Not needing to be brave. Not needing to become the version of himself his father expected. So what do we do with that legacy? What do we do with our own unsent letters? With our silences? With our attempts to build ourselves back up from emotional wreckage? Kafka didn't give us formulas. He gave us images. He gave us feeling. He held up an unfiltered mirror and said, "Look." And that look hurts, but it also frees. Because in it, we're not alone. Because when we read him, we recognize ourselves. We understand that the discomfort we carry, the unease that never quite leaves, isn't madness or weakness or ungratefulness. It's the echo of a childhood where we had to hide just to survive. And once you start to understand that, something shifts. Not all at once, not like a thunderclap, but slowly, like a crack forming in a wall you thought would never budge. You begin to speak with the voice you were told to keep quiet. You start to look for relationships where you don't have to ask permission to just be. You start to see the child you were not as weak, but as incredibly brave. Brave for holding on. Brave for surviving what didn't make sense. Brave for continuing to breathe, even when there was no space for you in your own home. Maybe we'll never be able to heal completely. Maybe the wound will always be there, like a scar that flares up when touched by a word, a memory, a look. But that scar can become a symbol too. A place to speak from. A place to see ourselves and others with compassion. Because once you understand where your pain comes from, you start to see where others' pain comes from too. And judgment begins to fade. It's not about blame or revenge anymore. It's about breaking the cycle. About refusing to pass the wound on. About learning how to love without fear. Kafka never built a family of his own. He never found the shelter he longed for. But through his words, he gave us the chance to build one ourselves. A different kind. One that lives inside us. One that doesn't depend on someone else's approval. One where the child we were can finally rest. Because if his writing teaches us anything, it's that pain shouldn't be buried. That speaking about what hurt us isn't weakness, it's courage. And no one, absolutely no one, should carry the shame of being too sensitive for a world that never learned how to listen. Reading Kafka can feel like opening a window in a suffocating night. Not because it comforts you, but because it tells the truth. Because it gives you permission. Because it puts a name to the silence. It shows us that what breaks us can also reveal us. That pain, once named, loses some of its power. That we're not crazy for feeling what we feel. That our wound has a story. And that story, told with honesty, can become a lighthouse. We'll probably keep searching for the love we didn't get. We'll probably keep bumping into authority figures that awaken that old, primal fear we thought we left behind. But maybe, just maybe, with time and with our own words, we can create a new language. One that doesn't rely on perfection or performance. One where we can finally say, "This is who I am. This is what I felt. This is what hurt. And I'm still here." Family, as Kafka said without ever needing to say it outright, can be both cradle and abyss. It can be the place where we bloom, or the place where we learn to hide. But we don't have to stay trapped there. We can look back without lying to ourselves. We can speak, write, even scream if we need to. Because in that expression lies the seed of a different life. A life where what we inherited doesn't become a sentence, but a story we reshape. A story that, even with its shadows, we can begin to tell again in our own voice. And maybe, just maybe, in that retelling, the child we once were can finally start to feel at home.